Carolina?
Ahí estoy grabando.
Excelente, muy bien. Bueno, entonces, después, por favor, cuando termina el evento, que por favor recordamos, Carolina, que los eventos del departamento por definición terminan a las 8 de la noche.
Sí, sí, sí.
Ok, perfecto. Porque es el compromiso que tenemos con la gente, que ya saben que a las 8 de Argentina quedan liberados. Entonces, por favor, cuando terminan, recuerden que al terminar el evento, sus equipos les van a avisar que se está haciendo el proceso de terminación de la grabación, que lleva más o menos 1 hora aproximadamente, pero ustedes se pueden ir a dormir, no pasa nada, el computador sigue.
Okay.
Y lo que sí les pido es que una vez que esté la grabación terminada, me la envíen.
Okay.
¿Correcto? Me la compartan, entonces yo la envío y yo la edito, le doy el formato de los eventos nuestros para que la podamos publicar. No me molesta tener 2 versiones, al contrario, siempre es mejor. Bueno, a partir de ahora, ustedes las dos son cohospedadoras, ustedes pueden hacer ingresar a las personas que están en sala de espera. Yo recomiendo que una vez empezado el evento, levanten la sala de espera. No hay mucha gente anotada, posiblemente porque el evento se anunció en inglés y no hay mucha gente que esté en condiciones de seguir un evento como este en inglés. De manera que, bueno, yo la verdad que me encantaría escucharlo porque el tema me apasiona, pero lo voy a escuchar cuando se grabe, porque en la grabación, porque la verdad es que estoy molido y me quiero ir a dormir acá, son las 11 de la noche. Y no dormimos en los últimos 2 días, así que quiero irme a dormir. Ahora, si me quedo, aunque fuera la cosa más interesante de la Tierra, me quedaría dormido igual. Así que...
¿Te parece que admita a los oradores un ratito antes que a los...?
Sí, claro, sí. Con que empieces el evento a las 6:15, está bien. Cuando se abra el evento, Andrea va a tomar la palabra a nombre del departamento. No hagas entrar todavía a quienes no son oradores. ¿No?
A los profesores nada más.
Exacto.
Dolan,
Una vez que hayan ingresado todos, Andrea, hello, good afternoon,
How are you?
Chris, good afternoon, Sybyl. You are very welcome. Thank you very much for being here. I myself, I'm the chairman of the Department of Social Sciences, and Professor Andrea Gastron is the vice chairwoman of the department. And I beg your pardon, but I am now in Catalonia. I traveled today from Argentina, and I'm not in Barcelona. I'm in Girona, which is the city where I live here. I made all the trip from Argentina to Barcelona, and then with a strike here, we have a railroad strike here going on. I had to go by car 2.5 hours to Girona, and I am absolutely destroyed. So I came only to oversee that everything's all right, that you're here, to greet you, to give you our welcome and our thanks for being here with us today. But afterwards, I'm very sorry, but I can't stay awake. No, so I will afterwards. I will attend the meeting and learn a lot. But by the saved version we will have. So I will leave everything in the hands of Carolina, who's a very, very well-known and respected professor in the department, and Professor Andrea Gastron, who will be the representative of the department. No? So I beg your pardon once more.
Oh, please, thank you for the welcome. Hope you get some rest.
Thank you. I hope so. Here, this is Girona is a small town. It's a very small town in the near the Pyrenees, and so it's a very nice place to sleep because it's very quiet. It's not Buenos Aires, no. It's not Buenos Aires. It's a very nice place to have a good sleep. So, entonces, me voy.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Luego,
De vuelta por el error, doctor.
no, todo bien. Entonces, Lucía está en representación del departamento, es nuestra futura becaria, y entonces cualquier cosa cuenta con ella. Y les pido por favor que simplemente cuando terminen, les va a aparecer, cuando salgan, donde dice finalizar, les va a preguntar si finalizan la reunión, sí. Bueno,
perfecto.
Eso es todo.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Hola, Andrea.
Gracias. Thank
buenas
you.
noches.
Thank you all.
Buenas noches.
Bye bye.
Que descansen. Andrea.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you, Andrea? Now that we have our guest with us.
¿Qué tal? Claro, bueno, yo te cuento que mi situación es un poco mejor que la de Ricardo, pero no puedo estar mucho tiempo sentada porque tengo un tema lumbar. Entonces no me autorizaron a estar sentada mucho tiempo. Estoy con un tratamiento, bueno, complicado, así que si ves que voy a tener que apagar mi cámara en algún momento porque voy a tener que estar acostada en el piso, o sea, lo voy a escuchar, pero no me pidas que hable porque voy a estar muteada. Lo voy a escuchar, pero no voy a poder hablar, lo cual es lamentable, pero bueno, lamentablemente es la única manera que yo podía de acompañar.
Gracias.
Y así que me vas a ver que en algún momento voy a desaparecer y es porque estoy escuchando con todos mis sentidos.
Ok.
Voy a escucharte con los ojos cerrados.
Dale, genial. Bueno, que te mejores pronto antes que nada y bueno.
No, por favor.
Paso entonces al inglés. ¿Querés? Vos vas a alargar, vos nos presentás al
sí,
público.
yo voy a... okay, we can talk in English if you want, because...
yes, because Professor Dolan is not a Spanish spoker.
You don't understand at all? Sybyl and Dolan
Sybyl, yes.
and Chris?
Sybyl lives here. She's the head of the international relations at UCEMA.
Ah, okay. So, ¿entiendes español, Sybyl?
Yo sí. Sí, yo creo que no.
Ok. Bueno, dado que el evento es en la Argentina. ¿También? Just a little? Ok.
Un poco, yeah. My wife
bueno.
Your wife is Puerto Rican, great.
Yeah.
Ok, entonces si ustedes entienden español, dado que, no sé qué te parece, Carolina, digamos, la bienvenida yo la puedo dar en español si prefieres, como quieras, pero como esto es...
No, me parece muy bien, yo tengo los CV de los profesores, así que después los leo y los presento yo en inglés, si quieres.
Ok, vamos a tener un evento bilingüe entonces.
Sí, exacto, genial.
Ok.
¿Te parece bien,
entonces,
Andrea, dejo entrar a la gente?
Sí, yo simplemente quería pedirles disculpas por esta situación de que I will have to turn my camera off because of health problems. So I can't be seated for a long time. I have to rest, to be, no sé, acostada. Bueno, no sé, live. Yes.
Not a problem.
Yes.
No problem, okay. Andrea. Muchas gracias.
So, well.
Muchas gracias por eso.
No, por favor, los voy a escuchar sin la cámara.
Dale.
Okay?
No hay problema.
Perfecto.
I will turn my camera off.
¿Dejo entrar a la gente entonces?
A partir de ahora vos sos la dueña, yo presento
bueno,
y...
Buenísimo.
Como...
voy admitiendo.
El currículum de los profesores los lees vos, es decir,
Sí, los tengo yo.
Ok, yo simplemente voy a hablar voy a presentar y agradecer en nombre del departamento
Sí.
por este evento.
Perfecto, perfecto. Ahí se están uniendo, así que los
Qué
tengo.
tema interesante realmente.
Y es muy actual. Sala de espera, tengo 5. ¿Cuál es 5? Admitir. Bueno, ahí creo que estamos todos, sala de espera, todos uniendo. Creo que estamos todos los participantes que están uniendo. Sala de espera. Creo que estamos todos, Andrea, si querés empezar.
Bueno, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes. Aquí en Buenos Aires, para mí es una alegría muy grande, es un gran honor, en mi nombre y también en el nombre de todo el equipo directivo del Departamento de Ciencias Sociales y en especial del director, del profesor Ricardo Rabinovich, darles a ustedes la bienvenida. Recién hablábamos con Carolina y también con los colegas aquí presentes acerca de la actualidad que tiene este tema, ¿no? Este es un tema que está en los diarios de todo el mundo, así que creo que no necesito agregar mucho más. Va a ser un evento bilingüe, como decíamos recién con Carolina, los profesores algo entienden de español, con lo cual pienso que tal vez las preguntas ustedes las puedan hacer en español y por ahí Carolina va seguramente a ayudar con la traducción. Así que bueno, por razones de salud no puedo estar mucho tiempo sentada, así que me van a ver que en algún momento voy a desaparecer de la cámara, voy a escucharlos, no voy a poder ser escuchada probablemente, pero sí los voy a escuchar. Así que bueno, no quiero robarles más tiempo porque realmente el tema promete y promete mucho. Así que bueno, Carolina, te paso la palabra y muy agradecida realmente por haber organizado y por haber invitado a los colegas a un tema tan interesante. Muchísimas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias a vos, Andrea. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Carolina González Rodriguez. I'm a member of the Social Sciences Department, which is hosting this very important event today for us at the University of Buenos Aires. It's very, very important, and we are really honored to have with us today Professors Sybyl Rhodes and Dolan. I'm going to introduce you to them. I'm going to introduce them to you in a little while, but in the meantime, I would just like to say thank you all so very much for your interest in this key issue. I believe that although we are far from Afghanistan and from the United States, even in the political arena, we could say nowadays, it still affects us all as human beings and as a humankind, that we are all in the same war and we are all part of the same boat. So basically, I want to express my personal gratitude once again to Professors Sybyl Rhodes and Dolan for being here with us and enlightening us a little bit with your knowledge and your experience about such an important issue. Professor Sybyl Rhodes holds a PhD in political sciences from the Stanford University, and I believe it is a BA Civil in Latin America Studies from the UNC Chapel Hill, where, by the way, I had the chance to have a semester there during my undergraduate years. So it brought us very nice memories to me, knowing that you are an alumni from UNC at Chapel Hill. She's the recipient of a Fulbright Award and of a Social Science Research Council from the United States Award as well. And currently she is the head of the International Relations Department at the Universidad del UCEMA, for which you are already one of us, Sybyl, one of us in Buenos Aires and in Argentina. And she is also the president of CADAL. CADAL is a non-governmental organization, and CADAL stands for Centro para la Apertura y el Desarrollo de América Latina. This is an extremely brief CV of Professor Rhodes, of course. Professor Dolan, Dr. Chris Dolan, is professor and director of the Master of Science program in Intelligence and Security Studies, and the director of the Center of Political History at Lebanon Valley College in Pennsylvania. He is also the recipient of 2 Fulbright U.S. Scholar Awards, one in the Republic of North Macedonia, and he is now currently teaching courses on the rule of law and civil society, and is conducting research on defense and foreign policy at the geopolitical and security implications of the Euro-Atlantic integration. So it's also same as with Professor Rhodes. This is a really brief CV from Professor Dolan. So what we are going to do, and we think it's a good alternative to conduct this meeting today, is Professor Rhodes, if it's okay with you, perhaps you can start with a brief introduction. After you, Professor Dolan could go ahead with his presentation on the topic. And afterwards, perhaps we all could engage in some brief conversation about the topic. And if any of you have any questions for our keynote speakers today, I would very much appreciate you write it down on the chat box, and I can read the questions for our guests. So again, thank you all very much. Professor Rhodes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Muchas gracias. Hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you also to Andrea and to Lucia and to Ricardo, who was here earlier, representing the law school in the UBA. It's an honor to be invited to speak with you. Chris and I, Professor Dolan and I, have not coordinated previously our remarks. Perhaps that's better. Just letting you all know we didn't make a plan beforehand, so I'm not sure exactly what he'll be speaking about. What I decided to do was to make a few remarks on 4 themes relevant to the topic seminar. Themes are first, the export of democracy in general, or democracy promotion by the United States, but also by other organizations. And I'll say just a few general things about what scholars have found about how it might work or not work, and why. The second theme will be Afghanistan itself, and particularly the U.S. intervention that began in 2001. The intervention itself, the different policies carried out by the U.S. administrations since then, and of course the withdrawal of troops that we witnessed in August. Then I'll say a few words. All of these will also be brief, but I'll say a few words about what I see as the regional and the geopolitical context of the pullout from Afghanistan. So I'll say a few words about politics between the great powers, but also politics in Central Asia. And finally, and this is if I have time, because I don't want to talk too long, so Carolina, please stop me if I do. But if I have time, I'll make a few remarks about what I think the impact of the intervention in Afghanistan means for the United States itself, for U.S. society and democracy. So first, the democracy promotion. The first thing I really want to say, because it's perhaps the main message I want to convey, is that I believe in democracy promotion. The nonviolent kind, I think it can work. I think it can help. Now, I believe the best kind of democracy promotion is setting a good example. This is a simple thing to say, and I'll make an analogy with parenting. We can try to be good parents. We want to teach our values to our children, and we can tell them a lot of things. And I am a parent, and I try to tell my child many things about the best way to act, the way to be. But I believe the best way to teach values is to set an example, to be a model. And that can work both because people see the virtues of a model, but it can also work, and I believe that in world politics, this is very important. It also helps to be successful. Democracy is more popular when democracies are powerful, wealthy, prosperous places that attract immigrants, that are places where people want to live. There's no getting around this fact. Success is part of the attraction, part of the appeal of democracy. So we are living in a time when I think democracies are less certain of themselves, in part because they know perhaps they haven't set good examples all the time. And many people who live in democracies across the world have less faith in democracy than they used to. They're less confident. And this is the disillusionment, the pessimism that we often hear these days about democracy. So the first thing I wanted to say was, and in spite of all that, I think democracy is a good model, and I think setting a good example is important, but also offering good advice, offering training, offering help with democracy can sometimes be a positive thing. Now, armed interventions to install democracy work less well. I'm not going to say they can never work, but they hardly ever work. And of course, they're morally far less defensible, right? Especially when the main objective of the intervention is not to install democracy. Hardly ever is. Hardly ever is. In this hemisphere, as I'm sure you're all aware, trying to use force to install democracy have not been really pro-democracy, but anti-communism, perhaps a business, and there can be many other reasons for carrying out armed interventions and other terrorism, interests, realist, state defense reasons. So we could discuss those other reasons for intervening, but my main point is that usually, even when democracy is presented as a reason for intervening in another country's affairs, it's most often not the main reason. And that makes democracy promotion much more difficult. And furthermore, installing democracy somewhere where there is and somewhere very poor, ethnically divided, that has the social and political structure relies upon clan systems, patriarchal clans. There really is a patriarchy, patriarchal clans that is the structure of the society. Trying to install democracy or even a centralized government can blow back in your face. So I think that's first. It's very difficult to do through coercion, but installing democracy, or at least promoting democracy, can be very important. And I believe in it. And I'll also say that current international law says that intervention is okay, not so much for installing democracy, but for purely humanitarian reasons. There are some scholars, outside interventions are done by the United Nations instead of just by one country or a coalition of countries. They tend to do slightly better. Also, I'll say that if we are going to intervene, to use force to promote democracy or human rights or liberalism and a lot of good things that we might associate with democracy. It's going to work better if you have many more people on the ground, human security forces, and not airstrikes. This will become relevant to what I'll say in a little while. Finally, about democracy, a promotion. It seems to me that for a time in the 90s, the US had a kind of, but that it's lost. I think because it was too hard. Again, it wasn't impossible. I was not willing to do it. Or politicians didn't paid a lot of money, between 1 and 2 trillion. So that's beyond my ability. That's enough of money.
Sybyl, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are having problems, or at least I am having problems listening to you. And there's a sign here that says that your bandwidth is very low. Do you think it would be helpful if you turn off your video camera? Perhaps we can listen to you better. I don't know if it's just me, the one having problems with your. Let's try there if you think. If you're okay.
Thank you for calling me. I'll try like this. And the other idea I have is to connect with my cell phone. Is this better?
It's a bit better. I don't know if you agree. It's a bit better. Yes, Sybyl. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. If it.
No, it's not.
It's less comfortable for me because I won't be able to see you all, but you will be able to hear me, which is what's important.
Okay.
Well, so I want to say that while the reason for intervening in Afghanistan and to get Osama bin Laden, because the Taliban refused to the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington in September. There also was a plan to turn Afghanistan into a shining showcase. I remember at the time, I'll just note because it might be interesting for you all, I thought that's probably not going to work. They should just treat Osama bin Laden like the criminal he is, and treat this as a criminal matter rather than turning it into a war. That was my time. But I did think, well, okay, if you really want to do this, turn Afghanistan into a shining model of democracy, if that works, it would be fantastic. Right? So, and my impression is that many people from the United States and from the NATO allies, the other countries who were and military since 2001, many of them have worked very hard to make a working democracy in Afghanistan because they cared. They worked very hard to provide more rights for women and girls, to provide development opportunities. So they're not bad people. They tried very much, and they're very worried now about their friends. They're also, I believe, many of the people I have seen are eager not to blame the Afghan government. They don't want to blame the Afghans for letting Kabul fall, for not holding out. So this is just an observation of how people who were involved in this democracy promotion mission that clearly has resulted in a of some of them.
We are losing you again, Sybyl. We are losing you again.
Specifically about democracy promotion.
Sybyl, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but I don't know.
I think this.
Sybyl, can you hear me? Oh, we lost her at all? I mean, Lucia, can you tell if Professor Rhodes is gone? She got disconnected. Yes, she has. Okay, so well, in the meantime, until we get Professor Rhodes again with us, do you think, Chris, you could go ahead with your presentation in the meantime? And after your presentation, we have Sybyl's closing up hers, if it's okay with you.
Sure. Yeah. No problem. Okay. Muchas gracias, by the way. Okay. So what I wanted to do was focus on, and let me know if my connection is unstable. So what I wanted to do is focus on several overarching themes that I've noticed and written a lot about, especially since the end of the Cold War. And so I think some of these themes have intersected. Number one, I'm a strong supporter of democracy, not by military intervention, but by multilateral cooperation and diplomacy. I think it's what Sybyl focused on with regard to soft power, I think is a very important point. It's better to promote democracy by having a great model and by focusing on building up as many friends and partners as possible. But democracy is also in big trouble right now. I think given the elections of Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Duda and Kaczynski in Poland, Duterte in the Philippines, that these are signs that democracy is under duress, let's just say. So the first theme here is that democracy is struggling. Also, I think the collapse of the Cold War in 1991 was a major significant event, which led to the absence of an anchor against the United States as a global power. So without having the Soviet Union to check and balance the United States, there was a moment called the unipolar moment where the United States rushed to fill the void. And I think that was troublesome looking at things in hindsight. I was a Fulbright in Kosovo, and Kosovo, I think, is the only successful model of humanitarian intervention since the early 1990s. Every other one has been a disaster, I think. I think the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the NATO intervention in Libya and the lack of, but then the air interventions in Syria have led to nothing but refugees, suffering, and mayhem in the Middle East. And I think that has been incredibly problematic. And so with the collapse of the Cold War and democracy being in trouble, I think that we've seen the return of great power politics. And I do, though, think that that's the sort of regular state of the international system, is that multipolarity and great power competition are the way in which the international system has worked for years. I think the bipolar structure of the Cold War was something that was not common. But I do think that multipolarity is resulting in a bounded US-led world and a bounded China world. And we're witnessing almost a decoupling of power between China and Russia. I also think that there's a intermingled with that great power competition, peppering it is the rise of transnational issues, transnational challenges. I think climate change is the most significant challenge of our lifetimes, and dealing with the climate crisis is one of the most important considerations. So I think you're seeing a cross-cutting of issues. And so what I want to do is I want to focus first on the wake of the US debacle, I think, in Afghanistan. I agree with Sybyl in that when the United States killed Osama bin Laden, the purpose of the war in Afghanistan became purposeless. it became American presidents, beginning with really beginning with Bush, of course, but also Obama, Trump, and now with Biden. I think it was right for Biden to leave. I didn't agree with the way in which the United States left Afghanistan, but I do think it was the right decision to do. From Bush to Obama to Trump, after bin Laden was killed, there was no real purpose to stay in Afghanistan. The mission became unclear. Transforming Afghanistan into a democracy, I think, was delusional and an exercise in hubris. I mean, it was classic U.S. American arrogance to think the United States could turn Afghanistan into another American state, basically. So I think that was foolhardy. And after the Biden administration announced it was withdrawing the last remaining U.S. military forces back in April, there was a debate that emerged about about the United States' role in the world, its commitment to its allies and its partners, and really the limitations of American military power. American military power is, it's shock and awe, right? It's overwhelming, but there are serious limitations to it. I think U.S. foreign policy has become militarized, and there's been less of a focus on diplomacy and commercial relationships and soft power. And I think that's been to the United States' disadvantage. U.S. foreign policy must consider, I would say, the prices that the U.S. public is willing to pay in order to pursue stability and security in the world, and whether military power should be more restrained. And I think you're seeing that in the United States today. U.S. expansion in the wake of the collapse of the Cold War has not made the United States more powerful and more influential. I think it's the opposite. I think the United States has become less powerful and less influential. The United States has been cutting its diplomatic core. It has been focusing less on the Department of State and more on the Department of Defense. I think that's a function of the way in which the U.S. political system domestically works. I think the defense industry has far too much power, and U.S. foreign policy is far too militarized. And there's been a premium put on military intervention. And there's been a lack of, I would say, humility, a lack of clarity among U.S. foreign policy elites that undermines relationships with U.S. allies. It harms U.S. credibility. It does not promote U.S. national security interests. And I think in the wake of the U.S. exit from Afghanistan, the United States really needs to sit back and reassess what its interests really are, determine the most important areas of interest, and recommit to its allies, to tell you the truth, and repair those relationships. So, and after the death of bin Laden, U.S. citizens were no longer willing to pay the price to maintain that level of force in a country like Afghanistan. I think U.S. foreign policymakers were of the view that what the United States did after the Second World War with Japan and with Germany could be replicated in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And that is not the greatest comparison in the world. Germany and Japan had similar interests, and that was to align with the United States against the Soviet Union. Their populations were different. Their per capita incomes were higher, even though, Nazi Germany was a genocidal, murderous regime. And given the crimes that were committed by Imperial Japan throughout the Asia Pacific, the comparisons just don't hold between Afghanistan and Japan and Germany in the wake of the Second World War. Today, a poll came out in late August that the war in Afghanistan wasn't even worth fighting for, especially after the death of bin Laden. So a large majority of US citizens believe the war in Iraq was too costly, not worth fighting. The consequences of the withdrawal from Afghanistan are difficult, as it could lead to a surge of extremist groups into the country. Endless wars in countries where threats to the United States and its allies are not obvious or spelled out clearly show the real limits that US citizens are willing to pay. And I think if President Biden is serious about a world defined in terms of democracies versus authoritarian or autocratic systems, then that is how democracies are supposed to reflect the views of the public in foreign policy. So when Biden talks about a foreign policy for the middle class, I think what he's trying to convince US citizens of is that foreign policy can benefit them. And I think over the last 20 years, US foreign policy became detached between the elites who were pushing for many of these wars to remake the Middle East and America's image, and the US public. And a lot has happened during that period. The Great Recession of 2008 led to the rise of populism and nationalism. I mean, look at Brazil, Argentina, right? Chile, in Western democracies and democratic systems turned against globalization and began questioning the role of elites in their system, policymakers, that is. So Afghanistan became another tragic case where US military, diplomatic, and economic power and its ability to reshape the international system became fallible. It became vulnerable. I do think US foreign policy can be a force for positive change. Clearly, there's no question. It's just how it goes about doing it. I think the US can be a force for moral progress, but in the absence of humility, in the absence of restraint, and in the absence of self-awareness of what the US can accomplish, US foreign policy cannot be effective. And I think that's what we're absorbing in the United States today. How the US comes across, how the US treats immigrants who arrive at the US southern border with Mexico, those images of US cowboys who are working for immigration and customs enforcement and the detention of children in cages under Trump. I mean, that is the kind of imagery that really matters and really tells you a lot about a nation's values. And for a nation with such a rich history of immigration, and of course it's not been a completely positive one, that really hurts the US image in the world and makes it difficult to build a balancing coalition to deal with China or Russia or to fight COVID or to distribute vaccines. The US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the gains that were made by the Taliban raise a significant question for the US image in the world. And so I think that there's what I'd call it a reckoning in US foreign policy commitments today. There's clearly no question the United States needs its friends. It can't balance against China and Russia alone. It needs as many friends as possible. I think the United States has made significant mistakes in the area of trade and multilateralism. I think leaving the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a terrible idea on the part of the United States. But getting back to this notion of democracy under threat, I think that's true. All signs are showing, like data reported from Freedom House and VDEM, which is a leading democracy watchdog, have shown that the world is becoming less liberal, less democratic, and that's been accelerated by people and by elites. Anti-refugee and anti-immigrant sentiment led to Brexit. It led to the election of Donald Trump in 2016, a wave of right-wing populist governments in Europe and Latin America. The world is becoming less liberal, less democratic. And there's this process of autocratization. It's taken root in the US and in Brazil, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, where authoritarian and autocratic leaders expressed open hostility towards an independent media, courts, diversity, civil society groups. Each used emotional appeals and nostalgia to acquire and maintain power. Trump used birtherism, right, in the United States as a way of attacking President Obama. Kaczynski in Poland politicized the Smolensk plane crash that killed the Polish president, and Viktor Orban has used anti-Semitism to attack George Soros and migrants, and these things are now entering into the mainstream. And so, and by the way, authoritarianism is not political conservatism. Authoritarianism is hostility to diversity, to complexity, to pluralism. And so I think the best way of combating authoritarianism is not with military force. It's with showing the world that you have better values, or that your values are appealing, let's just say. So I think that there must be some sort of reckoning that again takes place to contend with the autocratic direction that many democracies have have turned to. So I think a country like the United States should really reorient its understanding of what an alliance is, who its friends are. I think it's a good thing that Biden is trying to make U.S. foreign policy much more responsive to people and to link domestic policy with international relations. But U.S. alliance systems have to change. The traditional alliance that the U.S. has had in NATO is now shifting to the Asia Pacific. The new defense arrangement between the U.S. and Australia and the U.K. it's a game changer. It shows that where U.S. priorities are, and the very flexible alliance systems that it prefers to be in. And so, but I mean, how did we get here, right? I think a lot of this can be traced to maybe modernization theory, which presume that as societies develop, they would take on a common set of characteristics in terms of democracy and capitalism, and that didn't pan out. It didn't pan out in China. It did pan out in some places like South Korea and Taiwan, and in key nation states in South America, Latin America. But for the most part, it didn't work out in places the United States thought it would work out. So, and the hypocrisy in U.S. foreign policy, when the U.S. aligns with autocratic states, how can it promote democracy, right? So how does a country like the United States address that conundrum? And I think what China has demonstrated is that democracy and capitalism do not necessarily go hand in hand. And I think that this has broader implications for the United States beyond its relationship with its NATO allies or with other partner countries around the world. So I think the notion of democratic declines, democratic deficits, really damage the credibility of a country like the United States and its ability to develop alliances, given the spread of illiberalism and authoritarianism in the world. And I think you're seeing that really come out with the real failure of the United States to respond to COVID, which has just run rampant in the country. So what I want to do now is I just kind of want to start to maybe begin to wrap things up, and then is Sybyl back?
Yes, I came back on the cell phone.
Oh, okay. Oh, there you are, Sybyl. Okay. So I'll quickly wrap up, and I guess maybe instead of like pivoting to Asia, I'll pivot to Sybyl. Okay. I think following 9/11, following the terrorist attacks, when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban, installed a pro-Western national government in Kabul, NATO invoked Article 5 of the North Atlantic Charter. It's the only time it's been invoked, but I don't think the United States has reciprocated very well. I think U.S. foreign policy in the wake, this is the lesson of Afghanistan. I think the United States, its credibility is on the line, and my view is that the United States looks at its allies through you will hear Joe Biden talk about democracies versus authoritarian systems, but I think that and he could speak that language, and he's comfortable in doing so, and he's had a long career. He knows China very, very well. He knows authoritarian systems very, very well. But I think that's just rhetoric, to tell you the truth. Right now, U.S. foreign policy under Joe Biden is no different than it is under Donald Trump. Don't fool yourselves. Make no mistake. There's a lot of continuity in U.S. foreign policy, and I think in the wake of Afghanistan, we're learning that the United States does not tolerate challengers to its power in the world, and it will work overtime to engage in a security competition with a country like China. Less so with Russia. I think the United States feels that Russia is more of a disruptive force in the world, whereas China is the real threat. So the United States is going to work overtime. But the way in which it looks at alliances in the wake of Afghanistan and Iraq is through a transactional lens. Is another country trading in dual-use technologies? Is it using China's Huawei telecommunications networks? And if it is, the United States is going to have a problem with that. And that's going to put countries like France and Germany and maybe key allies or partner countries in Latin America really at odds with the United States. So U.S. foreign policy in the wake of Afghanistan is becoming more transactional. Are you with the United States in its geopolitical competition against China, or are you not? And so what does the world prefer? I think Biden has said the right things, but I think he's governing. It's almost indistinguishable from Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy. And American presidents had been wanting to, U.S. presidents had been wanting to get out of Afghanistan for 10 years now. They just didn't want to be the president who was perceived as having lost Afghanistan. And so Biden was willing to rip that Band-Aid off very, very quickly to gear up for big major challenges. I think the way in which American foreign policy elites look at the world is they have bigger fish to fry, and getting out of Afghanistan is one less distraction. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'll wait till questions, and I'll go back to, I'll defer back to my colleague, Sybyl.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Apologies for my technical difficulties. It was very interesting to listen to Chris. I'll just try to say a few things, mostly responding to some of the interesting comments he made. First, I'll say yes. Presidents wanted to get out of Afghanistan, and I think that he is. Chris identified a problem the U.S. faces, which is dealing with the rise of China, and a challenge to its preeminence in the world. And that's one of the things that in international relations we look at is that, well, these power transitions in the international system can be very thorny, can provoke anxiety and cause big superpowers to become nervous and potentially do very destructive things. I think, yes, different presidents have been trying to grapple with how the U.S. can handle this new challenge in the international system. Now, I think Chris may have also been about to say this, but I think it's important, therefore, to look at where Afghanistan is and the dilemmas facing the Taliban currently now, the new government of Afghanistan, which immediately, of course, they face a huge humanitarian, economic, social crisis, I believe, because the government of Afghanistan has been extremely dependent upon U.S. aid, as I believe one figure I saw was that 40% of the Afghan economy was determined by the U.S. aid. That's going to be a problem for the Taliban. The U.S. might hope to be done with Afghanistan. For the Taliban, having the U.S. be gone gives them a problem. They don't have someone to blame so much anymore for the problems that the population faces. They're going to have to accept some responsibility. Now, what kind of relationship will this new Afghanistan government, the Taliban, have with the rest of the world, especially with its neighbors? Even though they traditionally have a close relationship with parts of Pakistan, Pakistan is likely very worried. Other neighbors in South Asia are also likely extremely worried because people are pouring out of Afghanistan. There is a refugee crisis, tremendous humanitarian crisis, and I think that what we're going to see in the Central Asian neighborhood, tragically, is going to be tighter border controls, less trade, and even stronger movement towards especially Russia. I think especially Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are going to see that they very much want to be within the Russia orbit. the US once had dreams of promoting some kind of liberal new Silk Road in the Central Asian area. I think that dream has disappeared along with the dream of democracy in Afghanistan. China will be interested perhaps in working with the Taliban, but they're also going to be quite worried because China has what they view as a problem with their Uyghur Muslim population, where there is in fact an ongoing genocide. And so this is going to be humanitarian challenges clashing. And I have understood that some Uyghurs are very worried, Uyghurs within China are worried about being sent to Afghanistan. That was so there. It's not exactly clear how China will deal with the new government in Afghanistan, or how the rest of the world will deal with them. But the humanitarian challenges are likely to be such that it's going to be impossible for what we call the West to not also do something, even if they don't want to. So we have to keep that in mind, that this area of Central Asia is going to become more chaotic, more authoritarian, and this has to be something that all of the important powers, also Iran, Pakistan, the Central Asian countries, as well as the US, China, and Russia, are all going to have to worry about it. I don't want to talk too much longer. I will just mention something that I think is interesting, that the audience might be interested in discussing, which is the impact of this humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan on US society and politics. I completely agree with Chris that there needs to be a big evaluation of what happened, of mistakes that were made. The comparisons with leaving Saigon are so sharp, so dramatic, so many parallels, so terrible. The leaving behind the allies, it's so easy to remember Vietnamese waiting in little boats on the coastline to be picked up and never receiving that help. A long war, a superpower defeated. Really a lot of comparison to be doing. I'll just say one more thing about Vietnam, which is that now the US and Vietnam are pretty good, get along pretty well. Just to add a little bit of a longer term perspective. Now, I think civil military relations in the US are something that we're going to have to think about quite a bit. This war in Afghanistan was fought, Chris was right, most Americans didn't support it anymore, but also most of us, we barely even knew it was going on. It was fought by an entirely volunteer army, right? This is different from Vietnam. We didn't have the draft to make ordinary non-military families be brought into this conflict. We also didn't really know we were paying for it, in the sense of that there was not a war tax. There was not attention drawn to how the war was being financed. And it might be the case that with the all-volunteer army, the dynamic that occurred after Vietnam, in which soldiers felt very alienated by the way they were perceived back home by civilians, sometimes believing that civilian politicians had not supported the military effort, this can turn into quite a difficult challenge. And so I think that's really something that military and civilian and political leaders will have to worry about. I think I'm going to just stop here. I look forward to listening to questions from the audience and from Chris. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you both so very much. Both presentations were just amazing. I wrote in the chat box that if any of the participants might be interested in having a question for our speakers, and if you feel like doing it in Spanish, please write it down and I'd be happy to help with the translation to our fantastic guests, okay? So if there are no questions from the audience, okay, I'm gonna go with the first one, if it's okay with you. Well, you said so many interesting things. I have like 7 or 8 topics written down. First thing I would like to include as part of this discussion is that you said, si por favor pueden apagar los micrófonos, gracias. See, you said you used the word promotion of democracy. When Professor Rabinovich, the head of our department, and I were discussing the title of this event, he came up with that with many suggestions, and he was very kind to let me choose the title for the invitation, and I decided to go ahead with the word export, and there's a reason for this, and I bring this to you and see what you think about it. When you say promotion, you are aiming at some sort of suggestion. You are suggesting, you are inviting, here, come and get democracy, it works, it's good, it's fantastic. It will be much better for you guys in Afghanistan to go ahead with democracy. But with the word export, when we export goods or services, we are selling. Somebody is engaging in a purchase of that product. Somebody overseas is engaging in the purchase of that product. So the export of democracy is something that has been I've been having in my mind for some time, because in my view, the export of democracy, it is actually what the US was aiming at. They wanted people, they wanted in Afghanistan or anywhere else in the world to buy the idea, you know, to engage in that transaction. But of course, it didn't work. They invested a lot, but they didn't sell the idea. They didn't export. Not only they paid at promoting, but they also paid at selling the idea. I don't know if you Sybyl and Chris agrees with this, and if you do or if you don't, what do you think about it? Do you think that export the democracy is something way more difficult than just promoting democracy, or is more or less the same?
I'll go first. I can't see other screens, so I'll just answer quickly, and then I look forward to hearing Chris's answer also. I think, yeah, it was a good idea, Carolina, to call the event exporting, and I do. When I said I think democracy promotion was a good idea, I was referring to what we in the NGO world, because as you mentioned in the introduction of me, I do work with a local think tank NGO, and we one of the things we're concerned about is democracy, the human rights, and we have sometimes received funding from the National Endowment for the Democracy, which is a branch of the U.S. government. I think that transparently teaching people about how political parties work, how lobbying is regulated, how democracy can function, can be positive. I've had many people from countries all over the world who have learned things about how U.S. democracy works, and also by how other democracy in other countries works, especially in European countries, because they've received some grants from international cooperation to promote democracy. I think that one interpretation of that kind of promotion is that it could be very cynical, right? That this is all just about power. But I don't believe that. And in that sense, I wanted to say that first, because I do think that possibly one of the lessons people will draw from this total debacle in Afghanistan is that we should stop worrying about democracy altogether. But you're right, Carolina, that export, I think you're alluding to what I was getting at, which is that success and modeling being something that makes people want to have in their own countries is even more important. I do think it's more important. I believe in democracy promotion, but democracy, I don't know if export would say exactly, but perhaps almost the same thing. Observing and saying, yeah, we want to be like that. I think that's even more important, and it's more difficult to do when you make big, colossal mistakes, like the way the withdrawal from Afghanistan was handled. I'll just say that democracies make tremendous mistakes. The only thing that you can say is that in a democracy, it's much easier to have this discussion. This I think we say here in Argentina, autocritica, right? That's easier done in democracies. And I think if we're going to have faith in democracy, we have to have faith that eventually, the US, like other democracies, it can shift its course and do better. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sybyl. I don't know if you like to go there.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Sybyl, and thank you for the question, Carolina. I would just like to add. I think Sybyl nailed it in her explanation. I particularly noted her focus on civil society groups. I think just having been, part of the Fulbright program, it really, those sorts of programs are the ones that really make a difference. I think when you're talking about democracy on the ground, a group I had volunteered with in Kosovo, and I'm going to be volunteering again with in North Macedonia, is this group called the American Corner. It's sponsored by the United States Embassy. It's an embassy program in almost every country that the United States has an embassy in. And these are programs run where there is a focus on things like information literacy, being aware of disinformation, focusing on the right sort of media to digest. I think that there's democracy is not something that's top down. I think it's bottom up. And again, as Sybyl said, democracies are not perfect. The United States has had a long history of racial discrimination, Jim Crow segregation. I don't think the United States really fully became a democracy until the U.S. Constitution ratified, the U.S. ratified the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And that wasn't until 1920. And then with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, I think those sorts of achievements are the best messages that any country could send to the rest of the world. That is not exporting democracy, but showing that you have a good model of democracy and that you're more inclusive within your borders, and that you tolerate dissent and the rule of law and the operation of civil society groups. I think tolerance and pluralism are certainly better than an F-35 stealth fighter. I think that there are horribly tragic setbacks especially in a country like the United States. Charlottesville, where you had racist white supremacists, and then the former president tried to disrupt the constitutional transition of power in the United States on January 6th by aligning himself with extremist groups. And I don't think people really appreciate how close the United States came to being a full-fledged authoritarian state under Donald Trump. I really think that needs to be really emphasized. What the United States and its allies won the Cold War, yes, by pursuing a military buildup and through great power politics and geopolitical considerations. But I also think that if you were on the other side of the wall in Berlin, I think you were looking at the West and going, I want to wear blue jeans. I don't want to stand in a food line. I want to listen to the Beatles. I want to listen to what the West can provide. I want to watch U.S. American television. I want all of those things. Those organic, commercial, yes, but all products of a society that values tolerance and art and individual liberty and expression. So I was particularly moved when Sybyl focused on civil society groups as being the models of democracy and human rights. So I think it needs to be, we need to reconceptualize what it means to promote democracy, because we're so used to it being exported through military interventions and violence, and more about setting the right example and reversing democratic declines. But people sometimes, constructivism, right, in international relations, change takes place over longer time scales. This isn't going to take place overnight. I think the best message a country like the United States can send to the rest of the world in the wake of Afghanistan, in the wake of these disastrous military interventions, is to be the best, most tolerant, most democratic society it can be. And other countries will come along and say, yeah, I want something like that. I would like to emulate that maybe that is something that is working better than a police state or an authoritarian system. And so the rehabilitation of democracy is something that can only take place from the bottom up.
Thank you so very much. Let me read you a question we have from the audience. How does Professor Sybyl believes that authoritarianism in the area she indicated might affect the West in the near future? Ivanov is asking that.
Thank you for the question. I believe, so referring to Central Asia, I think that it affects the West in the sense of returning to the Russian, mostly the Russian orbit. After the Cold War ended, as Chris explained at the beginning of tonight's event, the U.S. found it in a singular position. We call it unipolarity and in international relations. And liberalism was extremely popular, so it was appealing. And I believe that there was a kind of a consensus between, we could call them realists and liberals in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, that the U.S. could be everywhere, and particularly it could go in areas that used to be part of the Soviet orbit. I think that now, as Chris also said, it seems like we're returning to more of a period of what he called great power politics, where Russia wants to say, well, no, we don't like it when you come close, when you're so influential in places that are in our orbit, so to speak. So there are many different ways to interpret this basic fact, which is it occurs at the level of grand strategy, the international relations system. But I do think that it also does mean that I think I said borders will be more closed, there will be less trade, there will be people who want to leave, people who want to live in freedom, who want economic prosperity. So there will be that, and then there will also be just a greater importance for Russia, in the case of the countries I especially mentioned. Now, I think perhaps that, speaking like a realist, Biden might be thinking, well, okay, this is not a region that is very prosperous, so they are not able to cooperate with one another, and they don't have a strong regional system, and we can't do it for them. And it's not the area of the highest strategic importance to the United States. So we'll just cut our losses, and that's not going to affect us in a way that is the most important. So that's my answer. I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you so much. I don't know if we don't have any further, if anybody feels like open his or her mic and go ahead with a question to our invited professors. Okay, so I have one last question. I will let you go free. Thank you so very much again to both of you for being here. One very key issue is that we've been discussing democracy, and this perhaps may be a little more oriented to you, Chris, given that you are teaching about the rule of law in the US. Here in Argentina, and Sybyl can tell you very, very well this, because she's, as I mentioned, she's one of us already. We've been having democracy for the last 30-something years. We are brand new democracy here. And there's this sense of disappointment with what the people were expecting from democracy. Our first democratic president, Raúl Alfonsín, he told the people that democracy fits, democracy teaches, and democracy cures everybody. Okay, so that was his slogan, his motto. And basically none of that happened. Okay, so it's been 30 years and we have 50% poverty rates and 50% inflation rates nowadays. So my question is, and going back to Afghanistan, and given the little I know about the issue, my question is, perhaps what we are all lacking is this idea of promoting the rule of law rather than democracy. Because democracy, in my view, it's a manner to access power. It's the best way to access power. But what do you guys do with the power once we grant you the power you have? Okay, so when we put you there, what do you government or politicians do with the power we give you once you have access the power? And not as much how do you access power, but what do you do with it afterwards? My question or my concern is, perhaps it's a problem with promoting the rule of law rather than democracy, and if so, what about the key elements necessary in order to have the rule of law? Maybe necessary to have an open society, exactly the one you were saying, Chris, like an open society including different perspectives, different people, different preferences, different ideas, or is it possible to promote the rule of law in a very tribal society such as Afghanistan? Is it imperative to have an open society in order to have a successful democracy and a successful exercise of power?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that when I teach rule of law, I try to teach it from a perspective of that at least in a democracy, a rule of law is more than just rhetoric, right? It's something that means something to you. You can feel it, right? We hold our leaders accountable for their actions. And if we don't like the way that they're governing, then we vote them out of office, and the losing party accepts that result, right? So I think that when it comes to rule of law and how best to promote it, it takes time, it takes a lot of care, it takes a lot of openness. Clashes take place between those embracing populism and nationalism and authoritarianism and others who promote the rule of law, people like me, us. And so I think that building political systems and societies based on the rule of law and civil society principles and resisting autocratic influence, I think it's essential. It's something that I think what we're going through now in this moment, or maybe it's longer than a moment, is appreciating the fact that with a democracy, with the rule of law, it's something that's constantly going on. It's not an end goal. It's a process. It's a process of expansion. And I've spent a lot of time in the Balkans, the Western Balkans, where there's so much history of nationalism and tension and the Ottomans and the Romans and Yugoslavia and this horrible genocide and ethnic conflict that has taken place. And so there's so much tension in that region of the world, and they talk about the rule of law, but a lot of people don't necessarily feel it because they're so tribal. Like I've been to Albania. I've lived in Kosovo, where if you're ethnically Albanian, you almost have it wired into your DNA that you're going to be intolerant towards the Serbs, and the Serbs are wired in a way where they're intolerant towards the Albanians, and sort of getting them to move from nationalism to patriotism, I think, is something that is a very difficult thing for many people to move towards. So focusing less on and this is difficult, right? To think of yourself less as an Albanian and more as a Kosovar. I think that is a difficult lift for a lot of people. So the rule of law, I think that once there is trust among partners and a tolerance for dissent, that's when democratic norms like civil society and rule of law, I don't necessarily think rule of law, and I teach this to my students here in the States, and that is, rule of law is not necessarily institutional. It's normative. It's something that we carry with us. It's how we view each other civilly. We don't speak over one another. We don't grab a weapon as soon as we feel tension. It's about transparency and media freedoms and judicial reform. So I think that there is something about rule of law that is more normative than institutional. And so I really liked how you framed moving from democracy to rule of law, because rule of law is part of democracy, but democracy is not just necessarily institutional. I think one of the problems that the United States faced in a country like Afghanistan is you go in, you blow a lot of stuff up, and you have an election, and that's democracy, right? Well, not necessarily. I mean, that's the easy part. Holding an election is an easy thing to do because it's institutional. If it's not tied to anything organic and values based and normative, then it's illiberal. So perhaps we need to lower our expectations and focus on building rule of law systems where law is not tied to a person or an individual. It's tied to a people, right? To a governing system and a set of norms, as opposed to a particular individual, because these are people who are supposed to be working for us in this society. And if we don't like it, we vote them out.
Thank you. I'm more than happy to hear you, because I 100% agree with you. I totally believe that the rule of law involves values and core values, and involves an acceptance, inherited, if you allow me, inherited acceptance of such core values. So yes, thank you very much, Sybyl. I don't know if you would like to go further with this.
I'll just say one or two things specifically about Afghanistan. I thought Chris's explanation of the rule of law as a process and that we're not at the end and we won't ever get there. I thought it was beautifully done, and I hope to improve it. But on the topic of Afghanistan itself and the difficulties of trying to promote or impose rule of law, but also democracy in the context of warlords or tribal leaders who were the real power holders in different regions of Afghanistan. I think there were instances in which even the elections were fraudulent. It involved lots of patrimonial behind the scenes kind of dealings between the US supported national government and the local power holders, and also the national justice system that the US supported government attempted to impose had tremendous difficulty enforcing the formal aspects of the rule of law, in part because it wasn't supported by these local power holders, and it was sometimes the case that judges might sentence someone, but if that someone wasn't supported by a warlord somewhere else, they could enact retribution upon that judge. We may see, sadly, I think we are seeing some of that retribution being carried out now. So repercussions of the unsuccessful attempt to impose a formal kind of rule of law. And the very last thing I'll say is that the tribal divisions and the regional divisions in Afghanistan have not actually gone away, so the Taliban is now going to have to deal with those too.
Indeed. It's and this is just a closing remark from Andre myself. Yes, I do think that what their major challenge is going to be their inner problems, their inner tribes and their inner problems. And one final very brief remark about China and the Taliban. I watched I think it was a BBC documentary or a special program. I believe it was BBC, I'm not sure, in which one professor, I think he was from the University of Chicago, he was mentioned that when he went to Afghanistan in order to check on all the laws and regulations that the Americans found when they got to Afghanistan, when they invaded Afghanistan, he noticed that not only the laws and the rules were a copycat of the Soviet laws and rules, but also the whole legal community, if you want to say, the whole legal idea or the whole legal environment was very much from the Soviet organization. So they had this authoritarian perspective when it comes to have laws or to have rulings or to engage among each other from the Soviet legal setting. So knowing what this professor said in this documentary, I wonder if it's going to be, and this is, I do hope I'm so totally wrong about this, but I wonder if it might be a little bit more easier for the Chinese than it was for the Americans, given this authoritarian setting that they found in Afghanistan, which I don't think that they managed to get rid of in the last 10 years, or in the 10 years the US was there. So hopefully I'm wrong, hopefully. So I don't know if any of the audience has any further questions, or if not, I can't see any further questions in our chat box. So, well, we are going to finish our event now. Once again, thank you so very much. It was an honor for us. It was an honor for me particularly. Thank you, Sybyl. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Andrea, especially you, Andrea, knowing that you are not going through a very comfortable situation with your health at the moment. So particular thanks to you, Andrea, to Professor Rabinovich. The Social Sciences Department at the University of Buenos Aires really wants to thank all of our participants or our audience. It was a major success. Let me tell you, Chris, Sybyl, you may already know being here, but Chris, our event was a success because we managed to keep the audience exactly the same throughout your whole presentation. So nobody left. And for that, I'm very, very much thankful to all of you. And I don't know, Andre, if you want to say the goodbye words.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting, all of the contributions. And I remain thinking about them, okay? Because one thing is to think about democracy when you are at the center of the global society, and a very different thing is to conceive democracy when you lack democracy from so many years as we in Latin America. So maybe there are many differences, and well, this makes me think and continue thinking, mainly when we live in a technological society as it is today. So it is a more complex society. It's a more complex kind of society nowadays. So, well, I remain thinking about all of the things that you discussed. And I want to thank you very, very much about all of your contributions, okay? Thank you.
Okay, well, we will be inviting you again, Chris. We will be inviting you again, Sybyl. So thank you again so very much, and good night to everybody.
Thanks so much, and good night.
Thank you. Good night. Adios.
Adios.
Ciao.